Hey everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I hope you've been having as much fun as I have in my home city, although the weather has been really strange for May. So I had the same thought when I got on the subway that I've had this past week, which is like, it's unnecessarily disgusting and I'm not sure why it's wet, but we're making do. So today I'm going to talk to you about building design systems that work for design and development. I work for Commvault Systems. We do data protection, cybersecurity, cyber resiliency. And so I've had a long career for however many years in B2B and a lot of like SaaS apps. So really what we're looking at is how do we, like what has been our design methodology that we've infused into our design systems in order to have the biggest impact possible. So when they hired me in 2019, I walked into a situation like this and I was like, I think it's great. No, I was like, okay, like there's a lot of work to do. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we went from this to something like this across the entire application. And hopefully there are some takeaways that you can also bring back to your own organizations. So there were a few things that we covered, and we'll go through all these in the presentation, just getting the right buy-in from the right stakeholders, as well as just establishing some key partners, and then from there, how do we derive patterns that really like inform our design system, and of course some of the challenges, like the very real things that we've had to overcome or are still working to overcome, honestly, and then some benefits that we've gotten as well. So first things first, in terms of getting buy-in, what I say about UX is like, everybody loves to weigh in with UX. I think everybody sees it as like an opportunity, but when it comes to actually doing something about the experience, it is really mostly our problem. And it's not even just our problem in terms of the design solutions and how it is we're going to make what we make, but it's also just kind of managing all of the different voices that are coming into this, because everybody loves to be a designer, and it's sort of easy for them to give their feedback to us in a way that isn't necessarily the same with the more invisible things like product management or development. So first things, like in terms of these stakeholders, I think of them as like different types. For our business stakeholders, these are folks where I try to ground the conversation around these four cornerstones. There's been a lot of really good discussion at this conference, I think, about how you actually quantify the value of UX. And I do think as an industry, we're still really figuring that out. But I find that putting the benefits of UX into this sort of language, even if we don't necessarily have all the data in the world that we need, what it does is it really helps to like people, it really helps people sort of like imagine the numbers behind it, so to speak. So when I talk about the benefits of UX, I talk about how it can improve efficiency for our customers, meaning decreasing the time they spend on the task, how it can improve the efficacy, meaning decreasing the error rate that the users of our customer base might be making, improving learnability, which has a real business benefit in terms of cutting down on training costs and things like that, as well as improving likability, which just really helps with brand trust. And so talking about things in this way is really helpful for stakeholders who are not going to be in the day-to-day trenches with you, like typically not the development teams, more like the leadership on those teams or on product management, because they don't necessarily care as much about like how the sausage is made and everything that has to go into it. More so like they just want to understand like what the vision is and why they should essentially be investing resources into this. But when it comes to the developers and the people who are in the trenches with you, the number one thing that I've found that really resonates them is with the idea of scale. Because engineers are always trying to do more with less. And the concepts of scale govern a lot of the tools that they work with as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. But here really is where the paradox of design systems is introduced, because on the one hand, we want to generate as much consistency as possible, but then on the other hand, we also need to optimize for very specific use cases. And so there is this sort of like tension there, because You can't make things so small that you end up getting a lot of different combinations, but you also can't make them so big that people have to consistently break them. So that's what I mean when I talk about this concept of modularity. With a design system, what really matters is that you hit the right note in terms of modularity. Again, if things are too small, then what's going to happen is people are going to be able to mix them in too many different ways, and even though they might be using the same component set, they're going to get stuff all over the place. And if things are too big, it means that they're constantly going to have to break things. So I think the hallmark of a very healthy design system is that it generates consistency. Consistency is not something that should be enforced. If you're spending a lot of your time, or if your team is spending a lot of their time enforcing consistency because people are putting things together wrong, then what that indicates to you is that something is a little bit off with the way you've set up your system. It should be a naturally occurring byproduct of a healthy system. So the next thing, after the stakeholder buy-in, one of the biggest things that we did was then we have to find our key partners, right? Commvault is a fairly large organization. It's not the biggest one I've ever worked at, but it is pretty big. We have about like 700 developers maybe, and of course, like most, probably everyone in this room, we are disproportionately small in terms of function compared to the rest of the organization. And this is par for the course, like with everywhere I've worked and with all of the folks that I talk to. So we are tiny and they are big. So we have to navigate in the org in a way that's very deliberate. And we cannot hold everybody's hand when it comes to actually like delivering the right designs for them. It's just completely unfeasible for us. So what we really need to do is figure out how we can like lift all boats by giving people tools that actually helps them get there on their own as much as possible. But in order to do that, we first have to design the stuff. And so what we did was across this huge organization, we looked at like, what are the key teams that we should be partnering with? The key team, really. Like, what is the team that, from a development and implementation standpoint, like, what's the team that has the bandwidth for it in terms of resourcing, that has the right top-down pressure on it in terms of motivation, and that also, you know, maybe just from a cultural standpoint is going to be more open or excited about these things. This was not exclusively my decision. There were a lot of other folks that weighed in on it. But finding the right partners within the organization was very important for us when we were first thinking about redesigning this entire application. And within that team, within sort of the landscape of everything that they're managing, what are the key pages or the key user flows that we should be focused on? Again, not entirely determined by me. This is something that it might be that thing that has the biggest impact to our customers, right? Or the thing that we're getting the most pressure from the market. And so we looked at a few key user flows that encapsulate specific pages as well as the sequence of those pages, right? And we honed in on that very specific area of the application. So now I really want to get into like the meat of this, which is designing our pattern, or really deriving our patterns, because we're doing the designs again, for those very specific use cases, right? Configuring a Kubernetes application for backup. You don't have to know what that means. I barely do. But we honed in on that like very specific area. And so now we need to think about, well, how do we abstract that into a reusable pattern? And the thing I want to, maybe point out for consideration is that all of the design systems that have been published, if you go through and look at them, like whatever it is, Material, Polaris, I don't know. But if you go through and you look on their sites, what you'll notice is that everybody, for the most part, has the same components, for the most part. Sometimes we have, unique business components. But nobody organizes their patterns in the same way. And it's kind of funny when you think about it, because technically, like if for all of your digital experiences, there's a lot of similarities, right? Like whether you're like shopping for an airplane flight or you're shopping for like groceries or whatever, right? Like, but there's a lot of similarities across our digital experiences. And yet we do not have sort of like very clear instructions or guidelines around our patterns that dictate how those components have been put together. And so what that tells us is, like, I think as an industry, we haven't yet figured out how to make explicit a lot of what we sort of inherently know about designing things. So what we did was really think about how are we going to organize our patterns. And this is where we introduced a concept that I call object-oriented design, and it's based off of what is called object-oriented development. Now, object-oriented development is it's essentially like a framework that governs a lot of our major programming languages, like Python, Java, whatever, right? And so this is also why developers are very familiar with these concepts, because they understand, like, object-oriented development is a thing that they know and that they leverage every day. And what it does is it breaks down an application into these sort of like reusable chunks. Because remember, developers scale, doing more with less. So when you think about something like, let's say, I don't know, an HR application, right? What they do is they have a concept called an employee that's a data object, right? So the concept is this, the data object is this concept that is the employee. Now, that object, it has what are called attributes. And so the attributes are essentially the things that help to define what an employee is. Like, every employee is going to have an email, a first name, a last name, a role, whatever else, a salary range, a location, etc. And every time you switch out the values of those attributes, what you do is you create a unique instance of that object. So instead of coding very specifically a chunk for every single employee, what they do is they just sort of have this back-end template that they then repopulate to create several different instances. And so what this helps us do is understand that, like, there are these sort of like nouns, right? Like these kind of like chunks that are operating in the back end, and those are ultimately the things that we actually design. Like, these are the things that we're actually visualizing. And then the other aspect of object-oriented development is what are called CRUD workflows. And so CRUD workflows, CRUD is an acronym that is basically it contains everything, like every sort of like possible action that a user can do in any application. So they can create things, and that means that they're adding a unique instance to the system, right? Like, oh, we have a new hire, and so now I'm going to fill in all of Miranda's data. They can retrieve things, meaning that they're searching, they're filtering, or they're viewing a specific instance of that object. Let me click on Miranda and let me see now, like, where does she, like, now I'm her new manager. Where does she live? When is her birthday? Like, whatever those kinds of things are. They can update things, meaning they can edit the values. Miranda moved, and so now we need to update her address. Or they can delete things, like she decided to move on and go to another company. And so when we were thinking about our patterns, right, and when we were thinking about those key pages that we designed, what we did was we abstracted as much as we could. Okay, they were configuring something for backup. What that really meant was they were creating something. Right? So you have to do a little bit of work as a designer, because our language doesn't always like directly map to this stuff. Rather, it's like, are you going to post that? Like, what you're really saying is, are you going to create a post? And so when you're thinking about like deriving your patterns, what you have to think about is, in the work that you've done, where am I seeing create flows? Where am I seeing retrieve ones, update ones, and delete ones? And then specifically, what is the data object to which those actions are being applied? And so what you can see here then is, like, this is sort of like how we looked at our key pages and realized, like, this is how we sort of like bucketed them into those general categories so that they could be reused as patterns. They were configuring something for backup. That meant they were creating something. They were viewing something, retrieving it, editing, deleting it. And so instead of us just thinking very, specifically they are configuring a Kubernetes application, what we realized was that they are creating a new workload, right? And so now if somebody is going and now they need to protect, say, their Salesforce application, we can look at Kubernetes and say, Well, in this case, they're both creating things, and so is this a create pattern that can be carried over to this same use case? And this was extremely helpful for us because, as I said, like, we have a massive application, we have a ton of developers, and I cannot have a team member that's dedicated to every single like area of the application. Instead, it's like, hey, we know that you guys have a lot of similarities, and this is how we're dealing with create workflows. And so the developers are like, oh, of course, like creating a new object, that means that we can follow these things, and my attributes for a Salesforce application are different than the attributes for a Kubernetes one. Like maybe they both have, you know, names, locations, whatever, but there's specific things about Salesforce. But all I have to do is sort of like switch out some of those attributes in that form field or in that wizard. And then the other thing I want to talk about from a component standpoint is just how we also in our design system use those object-oriented development principles to categorize our components. I think that atomic design has taken us pretty far, but I think that it also like possibly falls a little bit short in terms of our needs. And I also think it's a little bit strange, you know, that we're only oftentimes like we organize the components just alphabetically. So what we did was we looked at what the components do, really like what is their purpose. So we have what are called layout components. These are invisible to the eye, and they essentially help format the things on the page. And one of the main things they help format are what we call container components. These are things that you can see, like tiles or grids or lists. And what container components do is that they actually help to arrange what we call attribute components. If you think back to that data object, right? This is an attribute of that data object. We're looking at a specific workload. Every workload has a region. This region is something that is predefined. It's not like a form field you can enter. It's a drop-down. And so our drop-down component is an attribute component, because what it does is it displays the value of an attribute and it allows users to edit those values. So we arrange these components around purpose. We also have action components which trigger a workflow, and not pictured, we have system feedback components, which are things that are generated by the system based on some inputs to the user, like an alert or a threshold has been reached, an alert, a toast, whatever. And so if you look at our design system now, which this is a screenshot of it, what you see is that across the top we have our components that are organized according to their purpose. Every component has a link out to our sort of like the development version of it, the actual code that the developers can pull, but we also have internal pages that detail what the components do and do's and don'ts around them. You cannot, maybe nest certain types of container components within each other, for example, right? So you could put these sort of like guidelines around it. And then similarly, within our design system, we have a couple of things, like we have example pages and a couple of like workflow patterns that are a little more specific to our app, but we have this general area of our CRUD workflows. So if you need guidance, like if you have a new feature request that's coming in and they're going to have to perform a restore of like missing data, for example, then what we do is we sort of like do that work in the back of our head. Okay, when they're performing a restore, what they're actually doing is creating a restore job. And so we go into our create pattern archive, I guess, like that section of the library, and we see are these things that can be pulled and applied to this specific use case. And so quickly I want to talk about sort of the realities of this like cold, cruel world. So it's really nice, like, to get up on stage and be like, look, we have a shiny design system. But of course it's like, as anyone in this room knows, like, it's not that easy. And so the first thing you don't have to read all this, but the main thing to notice is just the timeline. So I've been at Commvault for 5 years, and this, like, to transform the entire application like that, I mean, we're looking at like 4 years, like I had to come in, I had to do a lot of observation, just, figure out the organization, connect with all the different folks, build all that trust. And then of course, we worked on those specific design pages. We abstracted the patterns. And the design system, it's something we're always adding to. Like, it will help get a lot of our projects 60, 70, 80% of the way there when we're first starting. But it doesn't have everything covered. And so we are constantly like uncovering new things and adding to the design system. But in terms of actually uplifting the entire application, I think it's a helpful reminder. You know, we're often told that everything is like an overnight success and things like that. And it's just not, like, real change is going to take time. The other thing I want to point out is that, so this is an older version of one of our landing pages, and if you're, where's my page title, right? Like, this page does not have a page title. This was a battle that I lost early on when we were designing out those pages. I had a couple other higher level stakeholders who were like, it's another row that pushes all the content down that people care about. And I was like, no, but we need page titles. And then, you know, I figured, in the interest of building trust, in the interest of how early on we were in this endeavor, and just the fact that, like I said, I was trying to like gain inroads, and I was like, this is not going to make or break us from a customer experience standpoint. Like, I acquiesced, and of course, a couple years later, when we were doing a full accessibility audit, we found that we had a failure if we didn't have a page title, and those same stakeholders were like, we should have a page title, and I was like, that's a really good idea. So you just lose something, like, it's fine, like, pick your battles. And then finally, because this is something that it scales out, it takes time. Not every team is going to be able to move at the same pace, so there will be breaks where they haven't been able to adopt your components, but they're meeting, you know, they're doing the best they can, you know? Or like, the entire application isn't shiny and new all at once, but it's fine, right? Like, you just have to, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And so then, just really quickly, because I'm at time, leveraging benefits. We are continuing to evolve the UI. It's very easy to do so, relatively easy to do so, now that we have this sort of like single point of change, right? So if we want to update the way that we're creating things, we can sort of give everyone those guidelines around it. If we want to update the UI to match branding, that's really easy for us to do from a technical component basis. And then secondly, in the past couple years, we were able to partner with a nonprofit organization in the New York City area to offer internship opportunities to folks who really wouldn't normally work in design and didn't have any pathways towards this career. And that's because if you think about it, this kind of framework ultimately makes design that much easier to learn. And so we could bring on folks who, as I said, there's a high barrier of entry a lot of the times into this field. And so we were able to open up the opportunity because it was a very easy starting point for them. Think about data objects, think about CRUD workflows, and we could ramp them up really quickly. So that's all I have for you. I will be around if there's any other questions or things like that. But thank you. Should I go over here?
Incredible. All right, let's see what we have. Thank you so much. Questions? All right. There's not coming up on here.
Sure.
Parisa, did you take a phased approach in implementing the new design system?
Yes. So it has to be phased. We actually didn't have a design system when we were working on those example pages, right? We had best practices, but we were just talking backstage, you have to write the book before you put it in the library. So that's really something that has to happen. We have to do a phased approach, both with all of the different patterns that we're uncovering, as well as with people's adoption with them.
That's awesome. What roles should be involved in creating design system? That's a great question.
Yes, it is. Obviously, you're designers. We also have what I call UX developers, so they're a little bit more technical when it comes to how these components can actually interplay with each other and what we can codify versus what we don't actually want to write in code in terms of getting people to follow it. Some things you can sort of minimize their ability to change, other things you don't want to with the code because they have to break it. So developers who have that front-end knowledge are very helpful. And then The back-end developers as well, like they're folks who they do understand a lot of the sort of like deeper technical constraints that we have to deal with for some of our patterns and things like that. So we had a couple of folks who I wouldn't even say are like the people that work with my designers who actually have to implement the components that we create, who actually have to implement our designs.
Great. That's good to include everyone. I think we have time for one more question real quick. What would you recommend when trying to manage an outdated design system distributed across existing pages that are actively being updated with a new system?
So, if I'm understanding this question correctly, what I would do is you have to have a unifying framework. That's what I'm saying is like when you take those object-oriented principles, it's very helpful. So if your system, like in terms of patterns, like I would look at how are users creating new things? Like what are our major workflows? And if I want to change that, right, take an example of that and show how you would redesign that and say, now this is how we're going to be creating new objects. We're not using a wizard for this multi-step process. We're going to use something else. I don't know. So I would say that. I would say if you are changing out your actual front-end components, we did that too. We moved from Angular to React in the same time frame. And so what we did was we worked with the developers, the front-end ones, to get as much parity as we could in terms of the actual functions of those components. And then we just sort of like redesigned, like we infused the UI that we wanted on the new component set. But I would say like don't lose any functions because that'll cause people to kind of freak out. There's like sometimes there's interesting stuff built into your existing component set. Carry all that over into if you're now doing React and build out your React tile or grid. Right. But yeah, redesign it the way that you want so that you can have that one-to-one mapping without freaking anyone out.
That's a great advice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Parisa. Let's give Parisa a big round of applause. Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.